A few years ago, I heard a story about how a handful of U.S. corporations contributed to and profited from mass incarceration in the United States during the 1980s and 1990s. The story was light on verifiable details and heavy on generalizations, so I didn't accept it as true. However, the story seemed very plausible, so I didn't entirely dismiss it either. Over the past 2 weeks, I have spent a tremendous amount of time researching this story, and in this video, I'm going to share the results of my research. I would then love to hear from you in the comment section whether you believe what I found is a coincidence or evidence of something more troubling. I am Dr. John Padfield, an engineer turned state representative turned business professor, and this is Business Reform, where we discuss issues at the intersection of business, technology, and society. In the 20 years between 1980 and 2000, the incarceration rate in U.S. state and federal prisons rose from 139 to 478 inmates per 100,000 residents. That equates to an average increase of 17% per year for 20 consecutive years. As always, links to all of my sources can be found in the description of this video. I want to stress these numbers only include state and federal prisons. If you include people incarcerated in county jails, by 2012 the incarceration rate in the United States was 707 people per 100,000 residents. While these numbers might be interesting, by themselves they lack context, such as how do these numbers compare to other countries. To put these numbers in context, as of 2012, the United States was the undisputed world leader in locking people up. The U.S. incarceration rate was 50% higher than the Russian Federation and nearly 6 times higher than the average incarceration rate of the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada. I chose those countries for comparison because they, along with the United States and New Zealand, comprise the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. Before diving into what caused the dramatic increase in incarceration rates, I need to explain that there are two common categories of problems. The first category is problems that have a single root cause, such as an oil stain on your garage floor. The root cause might be a leaking oil pan or a leaking oil filter, but it's highly probable there is a single root cause to this problem. The second category is problems such as the increase in obesity rate that do not have a single root cause. Instead, they have multiple contributing factors. Does a sedentary lifestyle cause obesity? Probably not by itself, but a sedentary lifestyle often contributes to obesity, just like sugary drinks, sleep deprivation, fast food, and many other factors. I am not suggesting big business is the root cause of the rapid increase in incarceration rates during the 1980s and 1990s, but I am suggesting big business was likely one of several contributing factors. After decades of remaining relatively stable, the U.S. incarceration rate began increasing in the early 1970s, leveled off for a couple of years during the Carter administration, then literally exploded in the early 1980s. That begs the question, what was going on in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s? In June 1971, President Nixon officially declared a war on drugs, and in July 1973, he created the Drug Enforcement Administration. These actions laid the foundation for President Reagan's war on drugs, which he started in 1981. The History Channel's website has a detailed article that covers everything related to the war on drugs, from First Lady Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign to a play-by-play account of President Reagan's anti-drug policies. When President Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, he vowed to crack down on substance abuse and reprioritize the war on drugs, which was originally initiated by President Richard Nixon in the early 1970s. In 1986, Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. This law allotted $1.7 billion to continue fighting the war on drugs and established mandatory minimum prison sentences for specific drug offenses. During the Reagan years, prison penalties for drug crimes skyrocketed, and this trend continued for many years. In fact, the number of people incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to more than 400,000 by 1997. That increase in incarcerated nonviolent drug offenders from 50,000 to 400,000 more than doubled the prison population and explains an increase of 350,000 people in state and federal prisons between 1980 and 1997. But those 350 nonviolent drug offenders only represent 42% of the increase in prison population between 1980 and 1997. So where did the other 479,000 prison inmates come from? Simply put, while the war on drugs was a big factor in skyrocketing incarceration rates, it clearly wasn't the only factor. I believe another significant factor in mass incarceration during the 1980s and 1990s was the rise of corporate-owned, for-profit prisons, which began in 1983 with the founding of Corrections Corporation of America, which changed its name to Core Civic in 2016. We will come back to the 2016 rebranding later in this video. According to SourceWatch, just months after its founding in 1983, Corrections Corporation of America was awarded its first federal contract to house detained immigrants in Texas. The GEO Group is another for-profit prison corporation, which was founded the following year in 1984. Corrections Corporation of America went public in 1986, which is the same year President Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which created mandatory minimum prison sentences for drug offenses. The GEO Group went public in 1994. 1994 was also the year the New York Times published an article about the growth of the private prison industry. You may be wondering how for-profit prisons might contribute to increasing incarceration rates. There are several possible connections. A 2011 report by the Justice Policy Institute documents how between 1995 and 2010, the growth of people incarcerated in private prisons outpaced the overall growth of the prison incarceration rate, which started leveling off around 2000. How did the growth of private prisons outpace the increase in the incarceration rate? As the old saying goes, follow the money. According to a 2015 article in the Washington Post, Corrections Corporation of America and the GEO Group donated over $10 million to candidates and spent over $25 million lobbying since 1989. These two companies, quote, rake in a combined $3.3 billion in annual revenue, and the private federal prison population more than doubled between 2000 and 2010. As you can probably guess, the $10 million in campaign donations was spent helping to elect state and federal legislators who wanted to increase prison sentences for a variety of crimes. But what type of legislation did private prison corporations spend $25 million lobbying for and against? Lobbying by private prisons helped kill transparency legislation, such as H.R. 1889, known as the Private Prison Information Act of 2007, which would have made private correctional facilities holding federal prisons under a contract with the federal government subject to the Freedom of Information Act, just like government-run prisons. According to research conducted by the Justice Policy Institute, private prisons also promoted tough-on-crime measures such as mandatory sentencing and three-strikes laws, truth in sentencing laws that limit parole eligibility and keep people in prison longer. Up to this point, we have only been talking about adult prison populations, but I would be negligent if I didn't mention the infamous Kids for Cash scandal that took place in 2009. Two Pennsylvania county judges were criminally charged for taking $2.6 million in kickbacks from two for-profit juvenile detention centers. Quote, for years, the juvenile court system in Wilkes-Barre operated like a conveyor belt. Youngsters were brought before judges without a lawyer, given hearings that lasted only a minute or two, and then sent off to juvenile prison for months for minor offenses. This is Epstein-level evil funded by two for-profit juvenile detention centers. I believe the judges and the executives of the corporate detention centers should have been charged with child trafficking and exploitation for what they did. If you're wondering what happened to the judges, the answer is not nearly enough in my opinion. One was convicted on 12 counts in 2011, and as of March 2025, he is still serving a 28-year prison sentence in a federal prison in Kentucky. The other judge received a 17-year prison sentence, but is now relaxing at home after President Biden commuted his sentence in December 2024. CBS News summarized it very succinctly when it wrote, quote, "A judge who helped orchestrate one of the worst judicial scandals in U.S. history, a scheme to send children to for-profit jails in exchange for kickbacks, was among the 1,500 people whose sentences were commuted by President Joe Biden this week." The judges were also ordered to pay more than $200 million in a civil suit, which is a nice symbolic victory, even though we all know that judgment will never be collected. These judges ordered children as young as 8 years old, many of them first-time offenders, to be immediately shackled, handcuffed, and taken away without giving them a chance to say goodbye to their families. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court eventually overturned the convictions of more than 2,300 children who were sentenced by these corrupt judges, who were bought and paid for by corrupt executives. Many of the victims suffered severe emotional issues and mental health problems, and a few of them even died from self-harm. But what about the adults being housed in for-profit prisons and detention centers? Remember when I said we would come back to the Corrections Corporation of America rebranding and changing their name to CoreCivic in 2016? A 2012 riot in a private prison run by Corrections Corporation of America resulted in the death of a prison guard and injuries to 16 staff members and 3 prisoners. That riot eventually led to a lengthy audit conducted by the Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General. To make a long story short, the Inspector General found numerous issues, including many safety issues within the corporate-run prison that had still not been corrected in the 4 years since the deadly 2012 prison riot. Shortly before the Inspector General's report was published in 2016, Corrections Corporation of America rebranded and changed their name to CoreCivic. According to a Washington Post story in 2016, Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates announced the Department of Justice had instructed the Bureau of Prisons to not renew contracts with private prisons when they expire because they are, quote, both less safe and less effective at providing correctional services than prisons run by the government. How do you measure the effectiveness of a prison? One way is to look at the recidivism rate. In the case of state prisoners in the early 1980s, about 41% of inmates released were rearrested within a few years, but that number increased to nearly 52% for inmates released in 1994. In the event anyone from Doge happens to watch this video, I am in support of and I appreciate your work. I am all in for finding and eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse in government spending. But I am also a firm believer in the ideas espoused by Stephen Covey in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. To paraphrase one of his key ideas, we should always strive to be efficient with things and effective with people. When it comes to the Bureau of Prisons, I would like to see more emphasis put on figuring out how to reduce recidivism so as a society we can have fewer repeat offenders going through the judicial system multiple times. Now let's briefly examine another industry that may have contributed to mass incarceration, the music industry. I want to start by clearly stating correlation does not equal causation. Just because 2 variables move together or change at the same time does not automatically mean one variable causes the other. However, when there is a logical explanation as to how one variable might be linked to another, it is worth exploring the possibility that a causal relationship exists. With that said, what was going on in the music industry during the time the incarceration rate in the United States was dramatically increasing? 1985 saw the birth of gangsta rap, which is a subgenre of rap music that, quote, conveys the culture and values of typical urban gangs. The album Straight Outta Compton by NWA is considered the first blockbuster gangsta rap album when it sold over 1 million copies in 1989 and went on to sell 3 million copies by 2015. In 2013, the digital media platform Complex.com published an article entitled The 25 Most Violent Rap Songs of All Time. 24 of those 25 most violent songs were released between 1989 and 2002. I can't play any of these songs for two reasons. First is the copyright issues, and the second is the fact this is a family-friendly channel. But I do want to share censored excerpts of the lyrics from one of the most famous gangsta rap songs of all time, Ice-T's 1992 song Cop Killer. I got my 12-gauge sawed off, I got my headlights turned off, I'm about to bust some shots off, I'm about to dust some cops off. I'm a cop killer, better you than me, cop killer, F police brutality, cop killer, I know your family's grievin', cop killer, but tonight we're getting even. The album Body Count, which included the song Cop Killer, sold over 500,000 copies in the United States, and as offensive as some of us might find those lyrics, I assure you they are not the worst lyrics in this subgenre of music. Other songs in the subgenre not only celebrate and encourage committing acts of violence against the police and the general public, they also graphically describe sexual assault on women, as well as brag about committing numerous other felonies. Do I think listening to this type of music would turn the average person into a violent criminal? No, I don't. And I am not advocating for censorship. But do I think music like this could encourage someone who already had antisocial tendencies and anger management issues to act upon their worst impulses? Yes, I do. To be clear, I am not blaming the music industry for crime any more than I would blame the firearms industry for someone who misuses their products. People are responsible for their own actions. There are millions of people who have listened to gangster rap without breaking laws, just as there are tens of millions of people who own firearms who have never broken a law. What do studies say about the link between listening to violent music and crime? There are numerous studies that claim a link exists, and there are numerous studies that claim no link exists. I have included links to a few of each of these types of studies in the description of this video. It is difficult to quantify the total revenue record labels earn from selling gangsta rap, and believe me, I have tried. What I found is that numerous gangsta rap artists recorded albums that sold multiple millions of copies. And these sales mainly occurred during the 1990s and early 2000s when global music sales were near their peak. To what degree did sales of millions of violent albums and CDs contribute to crime and mass incarceration? It's impossible to say, but I would love to hear your thoughts about this in the comment section. Before I make my last point about a connection between private prisons and gangsta rap, I want to recap the timeline of events we have discussed and add one more data point. In 1981, the war on drugs was launched, and the following year, the first for-profit prison was started. The year after that, the second for-profit prison was started, as it became obvious that prisons were going to be a growth industry. In 1985, the subgenre of gangsta rap was born, possibly in reaction to the war on drugs. In 1986, the first for-profit prison goes public, and 2 years later, BlackRock was founded by Larry Fink and 7 other partners. Then in 1989, gangsta rap has its first platinum album. Within 21 years of its founding, BlackRock was the biggest investor in private prisons. I cannot find the data to know exactly when BlackRock and Vanguard began purchasing stock in private prisons, but by 2015, they each owned hundreds of millions of dollars in private prison stock. So to summarize, by 2015, BlackRock, Vanguard, and GE all own major stock holdings in both private prison companies and music companies that sold millions of gangsta rap albums and CDs. However, I was unable to determine how much stock each investor owned in these companies during the 1990s. BlackRock, Vanguard, and GE own a lot of stock in a lot of different industries, so it's entirely possible it's just a coincidence they were profiting from higher incarceration rates through their holdings in private prisons, while simultaneously owning stock in music companies that might have contributed to those higher incarceration rates. However, some people believe executives within these big investment companies may have exerted pressure on music companies to promote gangsta rap to increase demand for and the profits from their private prison stocks. The data I found while researching this video only shows correlation, not causation. So based on the data, I cannot claim there was any collusion between the music industry and the private prison industry. But what do you think? Do you think violent lyrics contributed to the higher incarceration rates? Do you think executives from within the investment companies tried to promote more violent music to increase revenue from their holdings in private prisons? And what do you think about private prisons in general? I can't wait to read your comments.